Have you ever crossed paths with someone who made you feel deeply connected, yet completely uncertain at the same time? Someone who looked at you like you mattered, but could disappear just as easily, leaving you questioning whether you ever truly did. Stay with this until the end, because what you're about to understand doesn't just ease confusion, it changes how you interpret the entire experience. Not just what happened, but what was happening inside you all along. Because this is not simple confusion, it runs deeper than that. It starts quietly. At first, everything feels aligned, natural, effortless. There's a pull that doesn't make logical sense, but emotionally feels undeniable. Conversations flow. Emotions feel heightened. You feel seen in a way that feels rare, almost unfamiliar. And for a moment, it feels like this could actually be something real. Then the shift happens. Not dramatically, not with explanation, just a subtle change you can't fully name. They start to pull back. Messages slow, energy shifts, warmth fades into distance, and suddenly you're left in a space where nothing is clearly broken, but nothing feels the same either. And that's where your mind gets trapped. Because when something ends clearly, the brain can process it. It can grieve, it can close, it can move forward, but when something is unclear, the mind refuses to release it. It keeps trying to solve it. You replay conversations, you analyze tone, you revisit moments searching for answers that don't exist. Slowly, your peace is replaced with questions. Did I do something wrong? Did they ever really care? Why does this feel so strong if it isn't mutual? Without noticing it, your emotional state starts depending on their behavior. When they're close, you feel valued. When they withdraw, you feel rejected. This instability feels personal, but it isn't random. It is psychological. The brain doesn't only bond through consistency, it bonds through unpredictability. When attention comes and goes, the mind starts chasing it, not the person, but the feeling they create, and that's where attachment deepens. But there's another layer most people miss. Some individuals don't experience emotional closeness as comfort. For them, intimacy can feel overwhelming, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel too much without knowing how to hold it. So when connection deepens, something inside them reacts. Not always consciously, not always intentionally, but defensively. They pull away, not because you are not enough, not because the connection isn't real, but because closeness itself triggers discomfort. Vulnerability feels like loss of control, so distance becomes their way of self-regulating. And here is where the conflict begins. Your system moves toward connection when it feels real. Their system moves away when it feels real. So one reaches, the other retreats, and a cycle begins. The more you try, the more they pull back. The more they withdraw, the more you try to understand. Slowly, you begin abandoning your own emotional balance just to stabilize something that keeps shifting. You wait for replies. You overanalyze silence. You hold on to small moments like they define the whole connection. And deep down, you sense something is off, but those early moments feel too real to let go of. And that is what keeps you stuck. You are not chasing who they are now. You are chasing who they were at the beginning, the version that made you feel seen, chosen, understood, the version that made everything feel possible. And your mind keeps repeating one belief. If it felt that real once, it must still be there. But here is what's hard to accept. Not every intense connection is meant to become stable. Some enter your life not to settle, but to reveal patterns you were never aware of. They bring closeness and distance, clarity and confusion, all at once. And in that contrast, something is exposed, how much of yourself you are willing to lose just to maintain emotional access to someone else. And that is where awareness begins. You start noticing it was never only about them. It was about how you respond to inconsistency, how quickly you adjust yourself when attention fades, how easily your self-worth shifts based on someone else's availability. Even when you understand this logically, emotionally, you may still get pulled back in. Because this cycle rarely ends cleanly, you decide to move on. You create distance. You feel progress. Then something small happens, a message, a reaction, a reminder, and everything inside you reactivates. It feels like a loop, because your mind never received closure. It still treats it as unfinished, and the brain is built to seek completion. So it reopens the story again and again. Now add inconsistency, attention then silence, warmth then distance, and your nervous system forms anticipation. Not peace, not stability, anticipation. And anticipation is powerful because it keeps you waiting for the next moment that might feel like the beginning again. You are not just remembering them, you are responding to a pattern your nervous system learned. And that's why it feels so hard to break free, not only because of emotion, but because of conditioning over time. But beneath all of this, something else is happening. Awareness is forming. You start seeing that your reactions are not random, that your attachment is not purely love, that your confusion is not proof of their importance, but proof of inconsistency in the dynamic. And this awareness changes everything, because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it the same way again. And slowly the focus begins to shift from them back to you. You keep waiting for that next emotional rush, the next moment that makes everything feel intense and alive again. That's why walking away feels almost impossible sometimes. Even when part of you knows the cycle is hurting you, another part keeps pulling you back toward it. But this experience is not only happening inside you. The other person feels the connection too, even if they express it differently. Even if they appear detached, emotionally unavailable, or completely unaffected, the bond still exists beneath the surface. The difference is that their reaction often appears only when your energy begins to change. The moment you stop responding the same way, the moment you create distance or become less emotionally available, something shifts inside them. They feel the absence, maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way they fully understand, but emotionally they notice it. And that discomfort begins to activate them because suddenly the dynamic no longer feels predictable. They are no longer the one controlling the distance between you. They begin sensing that your presence may not always be guaranteed, and that uncertainty unsettles them. So they return. Sometimes subtly, sometimes emotionally, sometimes with just enough warmth to reconnect the attachment. Not necessarily because they suddenly gained clarity, but because they feel the shift. And once contact resumes, the pattern starts again. You allow yourself to hope. You reopen emotionally. You start believing that maybe this time things will finally become stable. But before long, the same confusion returns. The same silence appears. The same emotional distance slowly takes over again, and you are left trying to understand why something that feels so powerful can never seem to become secure. This is usually the point where self-doubt begins to grow. You start questioning your own emotions. Maybe you care too deeply. Maybe your expectations are unrealistic. Maybe you are somehow the reason the connection keeps failing. But the reality is not that you are too much. The real issue is becoming emotionally attached to inconsistency. Human beings need emotional stability to feel safe. Without consistency, the nervous system stays activated. Your mind keeps searching for reassurance, analyzing behavior, waiting for clarity, hoping for certainty. And because of that, you never truly relax. Even when nothing is happening externally, your mind remains exhausted internally. You feel drained because emotionally you are always on alert, always anticipating the next shift. Over time, this slowly changes the way you perceive relationships. Uncertainty starts to feel normal. Emotional inconsistency becomes familiar. You begin lowering your standards without even realizing it because you mistake intensity for depth. But emotional intensity alone does not mean something is healthy. Sometimes intensity is simply the result of imbalance, unpredictability, and emotional instability. Yet, despite all the confusion, the connection continues to live inside you. It shows up unexpectedly in random thoughts, memories that suddenly feel vivid again, emotions that return without warning. That is what makes it so difficult to detach completely. Your logic may understand the situation clearly, but your emotions still feel tied to something unfinished. It feels incomplete, like there is still a missing answer somewhere waiting to reveal itself. And because of that, hope quietly survives in the background. A part of you keeps believing maybe one day things will align. Maybe one day they will fully understand your value. Maybe one day everything will finally make sense. But while you remain emotionally connected to that possibility, something deeper is happening within you. Awareness begins to grow. Slowly, you start recognizing the cycle for what it truly is. You begin paying attention to what the relationship is actually giving you rather than what you hope it could become. And that awareness changes everything because once you clearly see a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore it the same way again. You begin realizing this connection has affected far more than your emotions. It has influenced your decisions, your behavior, your self-worth, even the way you relate to yourself. And this is the moment where the experience stops being only about them. Something inside you starts shifting internally. You are no longer simply trapped in the feelings. You're beginning to understand the psychology behind them. And with that understanding comes a powerful turning point. Instead of constantly asking why they behave the way they do, you begin asking a different question entirely. Why have you continued accepting something that consistently leaves you emotionally unstable? That single question redirects your entire focus inward. Suddenly, the goal is no longer chasing explanations from another person. The real challenge becomes confronting yourself honestly. That stage feels uncomfortable at first, because you start noticing truths you avoided before. You notice how much emotional labor you carried alone. You notice how often you silenced your own needs just to maintain the connection. You notice how many times you adjusted yourself emotionally out of fear that they might leave if you expressed too much. And slowly, a painful realization surfaces. You were not simply participating in the relationship. In many ways, you were carrying it entirely. You were investing energy into something that was never emotionally balanced from the beginning. At first, this realization does not feel empowering. It feels heartbreaking because clarity forces you to stop romanticizing what was happening. You can no longer tell yourself that a little more patience, a little more understanding, or a little more effort would suddenly transform everything. You finally see the imbalance clearly, and clarity often hurts before it heals. This is the stage where many people collapse emotionally, not because of rejection itself, but because they finally recognize how deeply they abandoned themselves trying to preserve someone else's presence. You become exhausted, not from loving another person, but from constantly overextending yourself emotionally. You become tired, not from caring deeply, but from being the only one consistently carrying the emotional weight. And inside that exhaustion, a transformation quietly begins. Your reactions start changing naturally. You stop rushing to respond immediately. You stop over-explaining your feelings, hoping to finally be understood. You stop seeking reassurance every time distance appears. Not because you stopped caring, but because awareness has changed you. You now understand that giving more never created stability. It only intensified the imbalance between you. So for the first time, you begin reclaiming your energy. It is not easy because part of you is still emotionally attached to the outcome. A part of you still hopes things might change. But another part of you, a stronger and more grounded part, begins making different choices. You start valuing peace more than emotional chaos. You start choosing clarity instead of confusion. Most importantly, you start choosing yourself. And that shift feels unfamiliar because your behavior is no longer being driven by fear of losing someone. It is being guided by self-respect. You stop fighting to secure their attention, and instead you begin protecting your own emotional well-being. As this internal change grows stronger, natural distance begins forming between you. Not manipulative distance, not forced silence, but genuine emotional space created by self-awareness. And this is where the entire dynamic begins to transform. The energy and emotional access you once gave endlessly is no longer available in the same way. The attention they once received without effort starts disappearing. The emotional safety of knowing you would always remain available begins fading. And that shift creates a reaction inside them. Sometimes subtle, sometimes delayed, but almost always noticeable. Because when someone senses they are losing access to a person who once gave endlessly, awareness begins to surface. They start recognizing your absence differently. They feel the emotional shift they once ignored. And for them, that feeling becomes deeply uncomfortable because now the balance of control has changed completely. You are no longer chasing their validation. You are no longer waiting for them to choose you. And for the first time, you are no longer trying to prove your worth to someone who could never fully recognize it, while you kept abandoning yourself to keep them close. And this is something entirely unfamiliar to them. The version of you they once had access to was always there, always reachable, always emotionally open. Now, that version is no longer available in the same way. That shift alone creates space for reflection on their side, a space they were previously able to avoid simply because they never had to confront your absence. But this is exactly where things become delicate, because this moment is also where many people undo their own progress. The instant they notice even a slight change in attention from the other person, they slip back into old patterns. They reopen emotional access too quickly. They lower their boundaries. They return to the same position they once held in the dynamic, and just like that, the cycle restarts again as if nothing had changed. However, if you stay grounded in what you now see clearly, if you remain anchored in your own sense of worth, something deeper begins to form within you. You start becoming internally stable in a way that is no longer dependent on how they behave. Their attention, their distance, their inconsistency, none of it controls your emotional state the way it used to. And that internal stability slowly transforms your perception of everything. You are no longer moved by temporary affection. You are no longer satisfied with inconsistent effort. You are no longer willing to sacrifice your own emotional balance for something uncertain that keeps pulling you in and out. This is what real growth looks like. Not loud, not performative, not dramatic, but quiet, steady, and irreversible. Because once you reach this point, even if they reappear, even if they show interest again, even if they try to reconnect, you are not operating from the same emotional place anymore. You don't respond with urgency. You don't ignore what you've learned. You don't overlook the patterns that once confused you. Instead, you see everything with clarity that wasn't available to you before. And that clarity becomes your strength, not power over them, but power over your own emotional direction. This is the stage where the entire experience stops controlling you. You are no longer waiting for a shift. You are no longer anticipating an outcome. You are simply standing in awareness, fully aware of what you will and will not accept. From this space, the connection no longer defines your world. Instead, it becomes a reflection of your standards, your boundaries, and what you are truly available for. And at this level, reality starts to speak for itself, not through interpretation, not through assumptions, but through direct outcomes. Things either align or they don't. There is no longer a confusing middle space where inconsistency is tolerated or excused. At this point, one of two things naturally unfolds. Not occasionally, not unpredictably, but consistently. Either the other person rises to meet the new dynamic, or they slowly fade from it. There is no longer a version of this connection where minimal effort still keeps access, because you are no longer participating from a place of emotional dependence. You are participating, if at all, from a place of self-respect. If the connection carries genuine depth beneath the confusion and instability, your shift in energy creates a natural response in them. Not because you are demanding change, but because the old pattern can no longer survive in the absence of your overextension. They can no longer rely on your constant availability. They can no longer offer inconsistency and still maintain full access to you. Something has changed in the structure itself, and that shift creates pressure, but not the kind they can easily ignore. It becomes internal. They are forced into awareness. They begin to feel the absence of the dynamic they once took for granted. And in that discomfort, reflection becomes possible. They are confronted with a choice they previously avoided: either meet you differently or lose access completely. If growth is possible within them, this is where it begins to surface. They start noticing their own behavior more honestly. They begin recognizing what they overlooked. They begin feeling the weight of your absence in a way they never allowed themselves to feel before. And slowly, their actions may begin to shift. More effort, more presence, more intention. Not perfect, not immediate, but different enough to notice. Because now they understand something they didn't understand before. You are not emotionally guaranteed anymore. But even if they return with change, the most important transformation has already happened within you. You are no longer the version of yourself who waits in uncertainty. You don't fall back into old emotional cycles. You don't ignore red flags in the name of hope. You don't mistake partial effort for real consistency. You see clearly now and you respond accordingly. This creates a completely different kind of connection, if it ever becomes one again. Not built on confusion, not driven by emotional highs and lows, but grounded in clarity, mutual effort, and emotional stability. And if both people truly meet at that level, then something real can finally begin. Not the fantasy of what you once hoped for, but something healthier, stronger, and far more stable, because both individuals had to face themselves to reach it. But if that shift never happens, if they remain stuck in the same patterns, if they cannot meet you at the level you have grown into, then the second outcome becomes inevitable. And in many ways, it is just as meaningful. You detach, not from frustration, not from emotional collapse, but from understanding. You see the situation without distortion. You realize that emotional intensity without consistency leads nowhere. You understand that staying attached to potential delays your own evolution. And with that realization, your attachment begins to dissolve naturally. At that point, you are no longer waiting for change. You are no longer hoping for a different version of them. You are no longer emotionally dependent on their presence or validation. You move forward with clarity, carrying yourself differently, more grounded, more aware, more aligned with who you are becoming. And the most powerful truth in all of this is simple. In both outcomes, you evolve. If they grow, you meet them from strength instead of need. If they don't, you leave without losing yourself in the process. There is no real loss anymore, only expansion. Because what once felt like emotional confusion was actually a process of awakening, one that was never only about them. It was about you learning to stop confusing inconsistency with love. It was about you stepping out of patterns that required you to shrink yourself to maintain connection. It was about you becoming someone who no longer negotiates their self-worth for emotional access. And once that shift becomes permanent, everything in your life begins to change. Not just this connection, but every connection after it. You no longer chase intensity. You look for alignment. You no longer tolerate emotional uncertainty as a substitute for love. You value consistency above everything else. And most importantly, you no longer lose yourself trying to keep someone who cannot meet you where you now stand. Because real connection is never about forcing someone to stay. It is about two people reaching a place where staying no longer feels like pressure, but like choice. And if it is truly meant for you, it will not meet you in your confusion anymore. It will meet you in your clarity, in your growth, and in the version of you that no longer needs to chase anything to feel whole. In the end, what you experience was never just about them. It was about what inconsistency awakened within you. The confusion, the attachment, the overthinking, all of it came from a cycle that kept you emotionally unbalanced, not a love that was truly stable. And once you see that clearly, everything changes. You stop chasing answers, stop chasing people, and start returning to yourself. Because real clarity doesn't make you hold on tighter. It makes you step back and choose peace. And that is the real ending. Not getting them to understand you, but finally understanding yourself enough to no longer stay where you are losing yourself.